Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm here on the same world as the last video and we'll be working on expanding this house. Anyways, I'll dive into some absolutely wild Reddit stories that'll help you unwind after whatever kind of day you've had, whether you're studying, working, or just need some background noise while you're doing your own thing. I also want to shout out the recent comments on my last video. It really means a lot since this channel is very new and every sub helps. Alright, first story here, and this one's called My Neighbour Has Been Stealing My Packages, so I started sending myself increasingly weird items to mess with them. I live in a duplex with paper-thin walls, and my neighbour Marcus, who's probably in his 30s, has been systematically stealing my deliveries for about 6 months now. At first I thought packages were just getting lost or delivered to the wrong address, but then I started noticing a pattern. Every time I got a delivery notification, my package would vanish within hours, and I'd catch glimpses of Marcus bringing in boxes that looked suspiciously like mine. I tried talking to him about it, casually asking if he'd seen any of my packages, but he'd just shrug and say he hadn't noticed anything. I contacted the delivery companies, filed reports with the postal service, but nothing changed. Marcus kept taking my stuff and acting like butter wouldn't melt in his mouth, so I decided to get creative instead of getting angry. I was going to have some fun with this situation. I started ordering the most bizarre random items I could think of, all addressed to myself but specifically chosen to confuse and hopefully embarrass whoever opened them. The first package contained a realistic-looking fake arm made of silicone, the kind they use for medical training. I watched from my window as Marcus grabbed it off my porch. That evening I heard muffled cursing through our shared wall and what sounded like something heavy being dropped. Package number 2 was a collection of vintage romance novels from the 1970s with covers featuring shirtless men with flowing hair and titles like Passion's Burning Embrace and The Duke's Forbidden Desire. I chose the most ridiculous ones I could find on eBay, complete with dog-eared pages and handwritten notes in the margins. For the third delivery, I ordered a professional clown costume, complete with oversized shoes, a red nose, and a rainbow wig, the kind that comes with detailed instructions for balloon animals and face painting techniques. I could barely contain my laughter, imagining Marcus trying to figure out why anyone would need a clown suit, but I wasn't done yet. Package 4 contained a pregnancy test. Not just one, but a bulk pack of 25 tests along with a congratulations card I'd written to myself that said thanks for being such a supportive neighbour. During this special time, I signed it with a fake name and added some baby stickers for good measure. The fifth package was perhaps my masterpiece, a realistic-looking security camera system with prominent packaging that screamed, "This house is under surveillance." I made sure to include fake installation instructions and a note about how excited I was to finally catch whoever had been stealing my packages. By this point, I could tell Marcus was getting paranoid. He'd started peeking through his blinds before grabbing packages, and I noticed he was taking longer to snatch them, like he was trying to figure out what might be inside first. For package 6, I went nuclear. I ordered a bulk shipment of adult diapers, along with a medical alert bracelet and some pamphlets about bladder control that I'd requested from various health organisations. I even included a fake prescription note about managing incontinence issues. The final straw came with package 7, a realistic-looking snake terrarium complete with heat lamps, feeding instructions, and a note about how excited I was to welcome my new pet python named Hercules to the neighbourhood. I'd even included care sheets and a membership card to a local reptile enthusiast group. That evening I heard shouting from next door, followed by what sounded like furniture being moved around frantically. About an hour later, there was a knock on my door. I opened it to find Marcus standing there, red-faced and holding a cardboard box. "Look," he said, "I think there's been some kind of mix-up with our deliveries. I've been accidentally getting your packages, and I wanted to return them." He thrust the box toward me, avoiding eye contact. I just assumed they were mine since they were on my porch, but clearly there's been some confusion. Inside the box were several of my actual packages that he'd apparently been hoarding, including some books I'd ordered weeks ago, and a phone charger I'd completely forgotten about. He mumbled something about being more careful about checking addresses and hurried back to his side of the duplex. I never had another package stolen after that. In fact, Marcus started going out of his way to make sure any deliveries that ended up near his door were immediately brought to me. Sometimes he'd even text me when he saw the delivery truck coming. The whole experience taught me that sometimes the best way to deal with a problem isn't confrontation, but creativity. Marcus learned his lesson without me having to involve landlords or police, and I got some entertainment value out of what had been a frustrating situation. I still live next to Marcus, and our relationship is actually pretty cordial. Now he waves when he sees me, and I occasionally get a package of his that I promptly return. We've never talked about the clown costume or the pregnancy tests, and I think we're both happier that way. And that's the end of that story. Honestly, I'm impressed by the commitment to the bits here, like ordering adult diapers and a snake terrarium just to mess with your package-stealing neighbour is next level petty, but also kind of brilliant. The fact that it actually worked and now they have a better relationship is just chef's kiss perfect. All right, moving on to the next story. This one's titled, I pretended to be engaged to avoid my co-workers' advances, and now it's gotten completely out of hand. I work at a mid-sized accounting firm, and about 8 months ago, we hired this guy named Derek for our audit department. Derek seemed nice enough at first, but he quickly developed what I can only describe as an obsession with me. He'd find excuses to stop by my desk multiple times a day, ask me to lunch constantly, and make comments about how we'd be perfect together. I tried being polite but firm, telling him I wasn't interested in dating co-workers, but Derek took this as a challenge rather than a rejection. He started bringing me coffee every morning, leaving little notes on my desk, and even went as far as to ask other co-workers about my relationship status and interests. The situation escalated when Derek cornered me in the break room one day and asked me point blank why I wouldn't give him a chance. He said he knew I was single and that we had so much in common, I was getting really uncomfortable. So in a moment of panic, I blurted out that I was actually engaged to someone from my college. Derek's face fell, and he apologized profusely, saying he had no idea and that he would have never pursued me if he'd known I was taken. I felt relief wash over me as he finally backed off, but I didn't realize I'd just opened a whole new can of worms. The next day, Derek approached me again, but this time he wanted to know all about my fiancée. He asked about the engagement ring, which I obviously didn't have, and wanted to hear the proposal story. I made up some vague details about a college boyfriend named Michael, who lived across the country and managed to deflect most of his questions. But Derek didn't stop there. He started asking other co-workers about my engagement, and soon the whole office knew I was supposedly getting married. People began congratulating me, asking to see my ring, and wanting to know when the wedding would be. I realized I needed a ring fast, so I bought a simple band from a department store and started wearing it to work when people asked about it. I'd make up stories about how Michael had proposed during a romantic weekend getaway, and how we were planning a small ceremony back in his hometown. The lies kept snowballing. My boss asked if I'd need time off for wedding planning. My co-workers wanted to throw me a bridal shower, and everyone kept asking when they'd get to meet my mysterious fiancé. Derek thankfully had backed off completely, but now I had an entire office full of people invested in my fake engagement. I created a fake social media account for Michael using stock photos of a generic-looking guy and started posting couple photos with strategic cropping to make it look like we were together. I even learned to Photoshop well enough to create believable images of us at restaurants and events. Things got really complicated when my boss announced that the company would be hosting a summer barbecue and that all employees were encouraged to bring their significant others. Everyone was excited to finally meet Michael, and I realized I was in way over my head. I spent weeks trying to figure out how to get out of this situation. I considered having Michael suddenly break up with me, but that would require explaining why I was devastated and dealing with everyone's sympathy. I thought about having him get sick or have a family emergency, but that would only delay the inevitable in desperation. I reached out to my actual ex-boyfriend from college. His name was Mike, which was close enough to Michael, and explained my ridiculous situation to. My surprise, he thought it was hilarious and agreed to help me out. He happened to be visiting the area for work anyway, and said he'd be happy to play my fiancée for one evening. The barbecue was surreal. Mike showed up looking the part and charmed everyone with stories about our college days and our supposed relationship. He was so convincing that even I started to believe we were actually engaged for a moment. Derek watched from across the yard, looking slightly suspicious, but he didn't say anything after the barbecue. I thought I was in the clear, but then my co-workers started planning a surprise engagement party. They wanted to celebrate Mike and me, and had already started organising food and decorations. I had to quickly have Michael get transferred to another city for work, which explained why he couldn't attend. Months passed and people kept asking about wedding plans. I'd make up stories about venue hunting and dress shopping, but I was running out of creative excuses. The fake engagement had taken on a life of its own, and I felt trapped in this web of lies I'd created. Everything came to a head when Derek, who had been quietly observing my behaviour, started asking pointed questions about inconsistencies in my stories. He'd noticed that my ring looked different in photos, and that some of my Michael stories didn't add up one day. He approached me privately and said he'd done some digging. He'd reverse searched the photos on my fake social media account and discovered they were stock images. He knew I'd been lying about the engagement and threatened to expose me unless I went on a date with him. I realised I had two choices. I could let Derek blackmail me into a date, or I could come clean to everyone about the fake engagement. I chose the nuclear option and sent an email to the entire office explaining that I'd made up the engagement to avoid unwanted advances from a co-worker. I didn't name Derek specifically, but everyone knew who I was talking about. The response was mixed. Some people were upset that I'd lied to them, while others were sympathetic about my situation. Derek was transferred to another department shortly after, and I never had to deal with his advances again. The fake engagement taught me that sometimes a small lie can spiral completely out of control. But it also showed me that my co-workers were generally supportive when they understood the real situation. I'm still at the same company, and while things were awkward for a while, most people have moved on, and we can laugh about it now. And that's the end of that story. Wow, what a tangled web we weave when first we practice to deceive. I mean, I get why she did it, but creating an entire fake fiancé complete with social media accounts and photoshopped pictures is some next level commitment to a lie. The fact that the creepy co-worker figured it out and tried to blackmail her just proves he was even worse than she thought. All right, let's move on to the next story. This one's called My Roommate Kept Eating My Food. So I started labeling everything with increasingly passive-aggressive notes. I've been living with my roommate Jessica for about a year now, and for the most part we get along fine. We split utilities, keep common areas clean, and respect each other's space. But there's one issue that's been driving me absolutely insane. She keeps eating my food. It started small at first, maybe a slice of pizza here, or some leftover Chinese takeout there. I'd noticed things missing from the fridge, and when I'd asked Jessica about it, she'd claim she had no idea what happened, or suggest that maybe I'd eaten it and forgotten. The problem escalated when I started buying groceries for meal prep. I'd spend my Sunday afternoons cooking chicken and vegetables, portioning everything into containers for the week, only to find half my meals gone. By Wednesday, when I confronted Jessica, she'd say she was really hungry and didn't think I'd mind since we're friends. I tried talking to her about it multiple times, explaining that I was on a tight budget and needed those meals for work, but she'd just apologise and promise it wouldn't happen again. Then the next week the same thing would happen, so I decided to get creative with my approach. Instead of confronting her directly, I started leaving increasingly passive-aggressive notes on my food items. The first note was simple: "Please don't eat this, it's for my lunch tomorrow, thanks." When that didn't work, I escalated to "This food is specifically portioned for my meal. Prep, please respect my grocery budget and find your own snacks. By the third week, I was getting more creative. This yogurt contains my hopes and dreams of having breakfast. Please don't crush them like you crush my leftover pizza. The notes became more elaborate and dramatic. This sandwich represents the last shred of faith I have in roommate boundaries. Please don't devour it, along with my trust. I started including fake nutritional information. Warning contains high levels of disappointment and betrayal, not suitable for consumption by food thieves. One particularly inspired note read, "This leftover pasta has been blessed by the ghost of my grandmother who died during the Great Depression. She's watching from beyond, and she's very disappointed in food waste." I even created a fake scientific study. Dear roommates, this cheese has been treated with a special enzyme that causes overwhelming guilt in people who eat food that doesn't belong to them. Side effects may include sudden urges to buy groceries and respect personal property. Jessica initially laughed at the notes, thinking they were funny, but as they became more elaborate and pointed, she started getting defensive. She'd leave her own notes, responding to mine saying things like, "Relax, it's just food," or "You're being way too dramatic about this." So I doubled down and started getting really specific. This apple has been individually numbered and catalogued. Any unauthorized consumption will result in a formal complaint to the roommate tribunal. I created an entire fake legal document titled the Official Roommate Food Consumption Agreement, complete with clauses about proper notification procedures and penalty fees for violations. The breakthrough came when I left a note that said, "This leftover Chinese food is the only thing standing between me and a complete emotional breakdown. Please don't be the straw that breaks the camel's back." That evening, Jessica knocked on my door, looking genuinely concerned. She said she hadn't realized how much the food situation was affecting me, and that she'd been inconsiderate about my budget and meal planning. She apologized sincerely and offered to pay me back for all the food she'd eaten over the past few months. We sat down and had an actual conversation about boundaries and respect, and worked out a system where she'd ask before taking anything. Jessica also started contributing to a shared grocery fund for common items like milk and bread, and she began doing her own meal prep so she wouldn't be tempted by my pre-made meals. The passive-aggressive notes had accomplished what direct confrontation couldn't. They'd made her realize how her actions were affecting me, while also injecting some humor into what had been a frustrating situation. We still laugh about some of the more ridiculous notes I left, and Jessica has kept a few of her favorites on her bulletin board as reminders. Our living situation is much more harmonious now, and I can actually count on having my meal prep containers intact when I get home from work. The whole experience taught me that sometimes creativity and humor can be more effective than serious confrontation. Jessica responded better to the absurdity of the situation than she had to my direct complaints. I still write the occasional silly note on my food, just for fun, but now it's more of an inside joke between us rather than a desperate attempt to protect my groceries. And that's the end of that story. I love how the passive-aggressive notes actually worked better than direct confrontation. Sometimes you just need to find the right approach for the right person, and apparently Jessica responded better to humor than serious conversations. Alright, next story. This one's called "I've been getting the same wrong number calls for 2 years, so I decided to play along." For the past 2 years, I've been getting phone calls from various people looking for someone named Margaret. Apparently, my phone number used to belong to this Margaret person, and she must have given it out to a lot of people before changing her number. At first, I'd politely explain that they had the wrong number and that I wasn't Margaret, but the calls kept coming. Doctors' offices calling about appointments, delivery services, trying to confirm addresses, friends and family members wanting to chat with Margaret. I tried blocking the numbers, but new ones would always pop up. It seemed like Margaret had lived a very full social life and had connections everywhere. I started to feel bad for all these people who were trying to reach someone who was essentially unreachable. That's when I decided to start playing along instead of immediately correcting callers. I began responding as Margaret to see what would happen the first few times. I was nervous, but as I got more comfortable, I started developing Margaret's personality. Margaret became a retired librarian who lived alone with 3 cats named Whiskers Mittens and Professor Fluffington. She was originally from Ohio, but had moved to Florida for the weather. She had strong opinions about bird watching and made excellent banana bread when Margaret's doctor's office called to remind her about her appointment. I'd respond in character, asking if I needed to bring anything special or if there were any new medications I should be aware of. I'd take detailed notes about Margaret's apparent health conditions. Margaret's friend Helen called regularly to chat about their book club meetings. I'd discuss the latest romance novel they were supposedly reading and share Margaret's thoughts on the plot twists. Helen seemed to enjoy our conversations and never suspected anything the grocery store called to let Margaret know her prescription was ready. I'd thank them and ask if there were any side effects I should watch out for. They'd provide detailed information about Margaret's various medications. Margaret's nephew called every few weeks to check on her. I'd update him on Margaret's activities, telling him about her garden and her volunteer work at the animal shelter. He always seemed pleased to hear that Margaret was doing well. I started keeping a notebook to track Margaret's life story so I could maintain consistency across calls. Margaret had 2 grown children who lived in different states. She'd worked at the public library for 30 years before retiring. She enjoyed crossword puzzles and had a fear of flying. When Margaret's insurance company called about a claim, I discussed the details of her fender bender in the grocery store parking lot. I'd explain how the other driver had been very understanding and that Margaret's car only had minor scratches. Margaret's hairdresser called to reschedule her appointment. I'd chat about how Margaret wanted to try a new style, something more adventurous than her usual perm. The hairdresser offered suggestions and seemed excited about Margaret's willingness to experiment. The most challenging call came from someone claiming to be Margaret's daughter, calling from California. She wanted to know why Margaret hadn't returned her calls. I explained that Margaret had been feeling under the weather, but was doing better now. I started to genuinely care about Margaret's well-being and the people in her life. Helen sounded lonely and really seemed to value their friendship. Margaret's nephew was clearly devoted to checking on his elderly aunt regularly. The calls became a highlight of my day. I'd look forward to hearing from Margaret's world and learning more about her relationships and daily activities. I became invested in maintaining Margaret's reputation as a kind, caring person. Everything changed when Margaret's doctor's office called with test results. They wanted to discuss Margaret's recent blood work and schedule a follow-up appointment. I realised I was in way over my head dealing with actual medical information. I finally broke character and explained to the nurse that I'd been getting wrong number calls for Margaret for 2 years and had been playing along, not knowing it would get so serious. The nurse was understanding, but concerned about Margaret's actual whereabouts. I started gradually ending my Margaret persona. When people called, I'd gently explain that I'd been receiving calls for Margaret, but that I wasn't actually her. Most people were understanding, though. Helen seemed particularly sad to learn that her regular phone friend wasn't real. The experience taught me about the unexpected connections we can form with strangers and how much people need human interaction in their daily lives. Margaret's friends and family clearly cared about her, and I'd inadvertently been providing comfort to people who missed her. I still occasionally get calls for Margaret, but now I politely redirect them. I sometimes wonder what happened to the real Margaret and whether she knows how many people are still trying to reach her. And that's the end of that story, honestly. This is both hilarious and kind of heartbreaking. Like, this person accidentally became Margaret's entire support system without realising it. The fact that they kept detailed notes and genuinely cared about consistency shows how invested they became in this fake life. All right, final story for today. This one's called My Neighbour Complained About My Dog Barking, so I recorded all the noise they make and created a daily report. I live in a townhouse complex with shared walls, and my neighbour Carol has been complaining about my dog Benny for months. According to her, Benny barks constantly, and is disturbing her peace. Carol has left notes on my door, called the landlord, and even threatened to call animal control. The thing is, Benny's actually a pretty quiet dog. He's a 7-year-old golden retriever who mostly sleeps and occasionally barks when someone rings the doorbell or when he sees other dogs during walks. But Carol makes it sound like he's howling non-stop. I tried talking to Carol about it, explaining Benny's typical behaviour and asking for specific times when the barking was problematic, but she'd just say it was constant and that I needed to do something about it. Carol escalated things by filing a formal complaint with our homeowners association, claiming that my dog was creating a nuisance and violating noise ordinances. I was required to attend a hearing to address the complaint. That's when I decided to get scientific about the situation. I bought a small recording device and set it up near the wall. I share with Carol I wanted to document exactly when and how often Benny was actually barking. But as I reviewed the recordings, I discovered something interesting. Benny barely barked at all, maybe 5 minutes total, throughout an entire day, but Carol's unit was generating constant noise. Carol apparently had a very loud television that she kept on at high volume. From early morning until late at night, I could hear every commercial, every news program, and every dramatic dialogue from her soap operas. She also had a habit of talking loudly on the phone, often having lengthy conversations about her personal problems. Her voice would carry through the walls as she discussed everything from her health issues to her dating life. Carol's daily routine included running some kind of exercise equipment that created a rhythmic thumping sound for about an hour every morning, starting at 6 a.m. She also had a habit of moving furniture around frequently. Usually in the evening, I started documenting everything in a spreadsheet, noting the time, duration, and type of noise coming from Carol's unit. Meanwhile, Benny's barking incidents were maybe 3 or 4 brief episodes per day, lasting less than a minute each. I created detailed daily reports, complete with timestamps and decibel measurements. Carol's television averaged about 45 decibels throughout the day, while Benny's barking peaked at about 60 decibels, but only for seconds at a time. The Homeowners Association hearing was scheduled for the following month, so I had plenty of time to gather evidence. I recorded Carol's unit for 3 weeks straight, documenting every noise disturbance. Carol's loudest episodes included what sounded like her practicing karaoke on Thursday evenings, a weekly phone argument with someone she called her good-for-nothing brother, and frequent sessions of what I can only describe as aggressive cleaning. I also discovered that Carol had guests over regularly, and they were significantly louder than my dog. Her friend Diane had a particularly piercing laugh that would echo through the walls during their afternoon coffee sessions. When the hearing arrived, I came prepared with charts, graphs, and audio samples. I presented my evidence showing that Carol's unit generated approximately 6 hours of noise daily, while Benny contributed less than 10 minutes. The Homeowners Association board was impressed by my documentation and somewhat amused by the thoroughness of my research. They listened to audio samples of both Carol's television and Benny's barking. Carol was clearly embarrassed when confronted with evidence of her own noise levels. She tried to argue that television noise was different from dog barking, but the board pointed out that noise ordinances don't discriminate by source. The board ultimately dismissed Carol's complaint and suggested that both units work on being more considerate neighbours. They recommended that Carol lower her television volume and that I continue monitoring Benny's behaviour after the hearing. Carol was noticeably quieter. For several weeks, her television volume decreased significantly, and she stopped moving furniture around in the evenings. She also avoided eye contact. Whenever we passed in the hallway, I continued recording for another month just to be safe, but the data showed that both units had dramatically reduced their noise output. Carol's daily noise generation dropped to about 2 hours, while Benny maintained his minimal barking schedule. The whole experience taught me the value of objective documentation and how people can be completely unaware of their own behaviour. Carol genuinely believed she was the victim of noise disturbance, while being the primary source of it herself. I still have all my recordings saved as evidence, just in case Carol decides to file another complaint, but our neighbourly relationship has actually improved. Since the hearing, we occasionally nod to each other in the parking lot. Benny continues to be his usual quiet self, and I've gained a reputation in the complex as someone who takes documentation seriously. Several other neighbours have asked me for advice about their own noise disputes, and that's the end of that story. The dedication to creating spreadsheets and decibel measurements, just to prove a point, is honestly impressive. And the fact that Carol was generating way more noise than the dog she was complaining about is just perfect irony. If you're still here listening to these stories, you're clearly someone who appreciates the weird and wonderful world of human behaviour. Consider subscribing if you want more of these tales from the internet, and I'll see you in the next one. Alright, let's dive into another one. This story is called "My co-worker kept stealing my lunch ideas, so I started leaving fake recipes in my desk." I work at a marketing agency, and there's this woman named Patricia who sits 2 desks over from me. Patricia has this annoying habit of looking over my shoulder when I'm eating lunch and then asking a million questions about what I'm having and how I made it. At first, I thought she was just being friendly, making conversation about food, but then I started noticing that Patricia would show up the next day with almost identical meals. She'd recreate whatever I'd brought sometimes, even asking me for the recipe outright. It became obvious that Patricia had zero creativity when it came to meal planning. She was basically using me as her personal food inspiration, which would have been fine if she'd just asked nicely, but instead she'd act like she'd come up with these amazing ideas. On her own, she'd bring in my Mediterranean quinoa salad and tell everyone about her new healthy eating phase. She'd copy my Thai curry recipe and claim she'd discovered this amazing new restaurant. She'd even recreate my grandmother's meatball recipe and talk about how she'd been experimenting with Italian cooking. I started getting irritated because Patricia would often make my dishes better than I did. She had a nicer kitchen and more time to cook, so her versions would look Instagram perfect, while mine looked like sad desk lunches. The final straw came when Patricia copied my signature dish, a Korean beef bowl that I'd spent weeks perfecting. She brought it to our office potluck, and everyone raved about Patricia's amazing Korean cooking skills. Meanwhile, I'd been planning to bring the same dish, so I decided to have some fun with the situation. I started leaving fake recipes in my desk drawer, where Patricia would definitely see them when she inevitably snooped around my workspace. The first fake recipe was for something I called Mediterranean tuna surprise, which involved mixing canned tuna with cottage cheese marshmallows and crushed potato chips. I made sure to include detailed instructions about how the marshmallows would caramelize beautifully. I watched Patricia carefully the next day, and sure enough, she'd clearly seen the recipe because she kept glancing at my lunch expectantly, probably wondering when I'd bring in my tuna surprise creation. A few days later, I left a recipe for avocado chocolate pasta, which called for mixing mashed avocados with cocoa powder and spaghetti noodles. I included a note about how this was a traditional dish from my fictional great-aunt Rosa. Patricia's eyes lit up. When she saw me writing what looked like another recipe, I made sure to act protective of my notebook, like I was guarding precious family secrets. The third fake recipe was for something called protein power smoothie bowls, which involved blending protein powder with pickle juice and serving it over crushed crackers. I wrote about how this was the latest health trend from California. I could tell Patricia was getting frustrated because she kept expecting me to bring these dishes to work, but I'd show up with completely normal lunches instead. The breakthrough came when I left a recipe for spicy peanut butter soup, which called for mixing peanut butter with hot sauce milk and crushed cornflakes. I included detailed instructions about simmering it for exactly 17 minutes. Patricia finally took the bait and brought in her version of the soup the next day. It looked absolutely disgusting, like chunky orange paste with floating cereal pieces. She'd clearly followed my fake recipe exactly. She took one spoonful in front of everyone, and I watched her face contort in disgust. She tried to play it off, saying the recipe must have been missing some ingredients, but everyone could tell it was inedible. Patricia quietly threw the entire container away and avoided eye contact with me for the rest of the day. She never asked about my recipes again and stopped hovering around my desk during lunch. I felt a little guilty about the soup incident, but Patricia had been stealing my ideas for months, without any consideration for how it made me feel. Our relationship at work became more professional. After that, Patricia started bringing in simple sandwiches and salads, probably from actual legitimate recipes she found online. I learned that sometimes the best way to handle someone who's taking advantage of your creativity is to let them expose themselves by following your lead a little too blindly. And that's the end of that story. Honestly, Patricia had it coming. Like, if you're going to steal someone's lunch ideas, at least have the decency to ask permission first. The fake recipe. Revenge was perfectly executed. Alright, next story. This one's called, I got tired of my roommate's boyfriend staying over constantly, so I started charging him rent. I live in a 2-bedroom apartment with my roommate Sarah, and we split everything 50-50, rent, utilities, groceries. The works, it's worked out great for about a year, until Sarah started dating. This guy, named Trevor. Trevor seemed nice enough at first, but then he started spending more and more time at our place. What began as occasional sleepovers turned into him being there almost every single night. The problem wasn't just that Trevor was always around. It was that he was using our utilities, eating our food, taking long showers, and generally treating our place like his second home. I tried talking to Sarah about it, but she'd brush off my concerns, saying Trevor was just staying over a few nights, and that it wasn't a big deal. But when I started keeping track, Trevor was sleeping at our apartment at least 5 nights a week. He'd use our Netflix account, take up space on our couch, leave his clothes in our bathroom, and even started receiving mail at our address. Sarah acted like this was completely normal. The final straw came when I got our electric bill, and it was nearly double what it usually was. Trevor had been taking hour-long showers every morning, running his laptop all day, and using our air conditioning like it was free. I realised that essentially we had a third roommate who wasn't paying any rent or contributing to household expenses, while Sarah and I were subsidising his living situation, so I decided to treat Trevor like what he actually was, a tenant. I drew up an official-looking rental agreement and left it on the kitchen counter, where both Sarah and Trevor would see it. The document stated that any person staying at the apartment more than 3 nights per week would be considered a resident and would be required to pay their proportional share of rent and utilities. I calculated that Trevor was using the apartment about 70% as much as either Sarah or I, so his monthly contribution should be around $400 plus his share of utilities. I included line items for everything: water usage, electricity, internet access, kitchen privileges, bathroom access, and storage space. I even added a cleaning deposit, since Trevor never helped with household chores. Sarah was furious when she saw the rental agreement. She said I was being ridiculous and that Trevor was just visiting, but I pointed out that visiting doesn't typically involve receiving mail and keeping a toothbrush permanently in the bathroom. Trevor was initially amused by the whole thing, thinking it was some kind of joke, but I explained very seriously that I wasn't comfortable essentially paying for someone else's housing without any discussion or agreement. I told them they had 3 options. Trevor could start contributing financially, he could limit his stays to actual visiting frequency, or Sarah could move out and find a place where she and Trevor could live together. Sarah argued that Trevor didn't use that much of the apartment's resources, but I pulled out my detailed log showing exactly how often he was there and what he was using. I documented everything from how many times he'd done laundry to how much coffee he'd consumed. I even calculated the cost of toilet paper and paper towels he'd used. The rental agreement included a clause stating that if Trevor wanted to contest any charges, he could provide his own usage documentation, but otherwise the fees would be considered accurate. Trevor started staying over, less frequently, after that limiting his visits to weekends, and maybe one night during the week. Sarah wasn't happy about it, but she couldn't argue with the math. A few weeks later, Trevor actually offered to start contributing $25 a week toward utilities, which I thought was fair, given his reduced presence at the apartment. Sarah and Trevor's relationship became more balanced. After that, they started spending time at his place too. Instead of always defaulting to ours, I learned that sometimes you have to treat roommate situations, like business relationships, with clear expectations and boundaries. Otherwise, people will take advantage of your generosity. The rental agreement is still posted on our refrigerator as a reminder that our apartment isn't a free hotel for anyone's significant other, and that's the end of that story. Honestly, good for them for standing up to the freeloading boyfriend. Like, if you're going to live somewhere, you need to pay your share. It's that simple. The detailed usage log was a nice touch. Alright, final story for today. This one's called My Upstairs Neighbour Kept Playing Loud Music, so I learnt their schedule and played it back at the worst possible times. I live in a second-floor apartment, and my upstairs neighbour Jake has been driving me insane with his music. He plays everything from heavy metal to electronic dance music at volumes that make my ceiling vibrate. The worst part is Jake's timing. He'll start blasting music at 7 in the morning on weekends, or play it until 2 in the morning on weeknights. I've tried knocking on his door multiple times, but he either doesn't answer or tells me he'll turn it down. Then doesn't I? Filed noise complaints with our landlord, but Jake would just deny everything and claim I was being oversensitive. The landlord basically told us to work it out ourselves, so I decided to get strategic about my approach. I started documenting Jake's schedule, noting when he left for work, when he came home, and most importantly, when he slept. I discovered that Jake worked night shifts on weekends and slept during the day on Saturday. And Sunday, he'd come home around 8 in the morning and sleep until about 4 in the afternoon. Jake also had a very specific routine. On weeknight mornings, he'd wake up at 6:30, take a shower, and leave for work by 7:45 every day like clockwork. Armed with this information, I invested in a decent sound system and positioned it directly under where I determined Jake's bedroom was located based on the sounds I heard from above. My revenge plan was simple. I would play Jake's own music back to him at the times when it would be most disruptive to his sleep schedule on Saturday morning at exactly 8:30 when Jake would be trying to fall asleep after his night shift. I started playing the same heavy metal album he'd been blasting the night before. I could hear him moving around upstairs, clearly disturbed by the music, but I kept it at a volume that was loud enough to be annoying, but not quite loud enough to violate noise ordinances. Jake came pounding on my door after about 20 minutes, demanding that I turn down the music. I politely explained that I was just enjoying some tunes and that the volume was perfectly reasonable. He argued that I was being intentionally disruptive, and I responded that I'd learned about good music timing from him and was simply following his example. The next day I waited until Jake had been asleep for about an hour, then started playing his favourite electronic dance music. I could hear his alarm clock going off repeatedly as he tried to reset his sleep schedule. Jake left me an angry note, saying that my music was affecting his work performance and that I needed to be more considerate. I wrote back suggesting that he might want to invest in some earplugs. I continued this pattern for about 2 weeks, playing Jake's music back to him during his designated sleep times. I made sure to use the exact same songs he'd been playing at inconsiderate hours. Jake finally cracked when I played a particularly aggressive death metal album on a Sunday afternoon when he was trying to nap before his night shift. He came downstairs looking exhausted and asked if we could call a truce. He admitted that he hadn't realised how disruptive his music was and apologised for not being more considerate. I agreed to stop my musical retaliation if Jake would agree to keep his music at reasonable volumes and avoid playing it during typical sleep hours. We actually worked out a pretty good system. Jake would text me if he wanted to play music loudly, and I'd let him know if it was a bad time. We also established quiet hours from 10 p.m. to 8 a.m. Our relationship improved significantly. After that, Jake even invited me to a few of his parties, and I discovered he was actually pretty cool. When he wasn't being inconsiderate, I learned that sometimes fighting fire with fire is the only way to make someone understand how their behaviour affects others. And that's the end of that story. Honestly, the musical revenge was perfectly executed, like giving someone a taste of their own medicine at the worst possible time is just chef's kiss. Thanks for hanging out with me while I shared these tales of petty revenge and creative problem solving. If you made it this far, you clearly enjoy this kind of content. So consider subscribing for more stories.